Hey everyone, for a second to last lecture of the semester. Okay, number 37 out of 38. So at the end of the semester, if you want to watch one of the lectures, you're like, oh, I need to refer back to whatever. You just click on them here at this link, and they'll always be there. So I'll get this posted. I'll get the whole semester will be up there. At the end of Friday, maybe we'll just do a huge lecture on Friday where I'll finish up all the fatigue stuff and then I'll go through the scenarios. I'll go through the case study. So if you can send me yours before Friday so I can get it in there in time, then I'll tell you what I would prescribe and I'll get this thing posted. Now, I want you to be creative. I want you to do it as so it's not just me reading my own words over and over of here's what I would do with this person. Like, well, that's what I said. But you can use what I say. You can come up with something novel. You can say, oh, no, I wouldn't do that at all I care about is that you demonstrate that you've learned physiology. And so we're going to finish up. Well, I'll echo muscle burning today. I'll re-discuss a little bit of that, major points, and then we'll just fatigue. We talked about ATP AGP ratio last time, and so I'll echo those points again, and then we'll just move forward through the rest of it. But with the exertional burning, muscle burning, you're doing resistance training, and the muscle is just it's just like acidic in there. You can do the follow the proton exercise, right? Where you just follow the hydrogen ion, right? pH, the power of hydrogen of these ions of the hydrogen minus its electron, right? Just a proton in there. And what you have is you have hexokinase, you're going to create one of them. You have PFK, you're going to create release a second hydrogen ion. And then down here at glyceraldehyde 3 phosphate dehydrogenase, G3P dehydrogenase, you're going to release two more. So now you're at 4. Pyruvate kinase right at the end, right before you make your pyruvate, which is a terminal step in glycolysis proper, right, would be that pyruvate kinase. You create two pyruvates. So you start with a 6 carbon molecule. Let's start with our G6P, glucose, and convert it to G6P through hexokinase. But hexokinase is sort of one access point into glycolysis. You could also get there through glycogen phosphorylase and phosphoglucomutase to create your G6P. But hexokinase, PFK, G3P dehydrogenase, and then pyruvate kinase. Now, pyruvate kinase, we are consuming two hydrogen ions. We're consuming two. And then if we use lactate dehydrogenase at the end, we're consuming two more. So just some ideas of, I'm not going to ask anything on a test, right? Because there is no final with this information. It's all practical, and we'll talk about it on Friday. But you know what ATP is, this energy source. ATP hydrolysis, you know what that is. You're hydrolyzing, you lyse your ATP, you throw in some water, and what you get out of is an ADP, a phosphate, and a hydrogen ion. The water, H2O, right? There are two H's and an O in water, unless your definition of water is somehow different from mine. An O and an H plugs up that that phosphate you chop off. An O and an H from the water plug up that, and then the other H goes floating off as your hydrogen ion. Oh, you know what the energy substrates are, right? Carbs, fats, proteins. We talked about all of this in mTOR. And, fat has, roughly 9 calories per gram, carbs and protein, roughly 4 calories per gram. Maybe you could say alcohol too, give it a 7. But then glucose, glycogen, how much do we have? Well, glycogen, I don't know, you have a pound or so. It really depends on how much you weigh, your athletic history, and how much muscle mass you have, your diet. I mean, there's a lot of things that are going to go into this, but let's just say on average, maybe 100 grams in your liver and another 350 grams or so in your muscle, something like that. But very ballpark. Glucose, I mean, you got less than 5 grams of this stuff. Your blood is not Kool-Aid, right? Your blood is not sweet. There's no cola flowing through your veins. And so during exercise, if you use this, you have a very tiny amount of this. Now you can do like hepatic glucose production and regulate that with the liver, but really up the pound over here, this is what you're consuming. Glycogen phosphorylase, phosphoglucomutase run through glycolysis. And so you end up, when you create a bunch of lactate coming from glycogen, you end up becoming more basic, right? So you're consuming hydrogen ions, you are not producing them. Glycolysis, the northern suburbs, right? So that would be either hexokinase to get in there from glucose, to get your G6P, glucose 6 phosphate, hexokinase if you're going from glucose, or it would be glycogen phosphorylase, phosphoglucomutase, that series of two. That's free. There's no ATP consumed there. So when people say, oh, glycolysis is an energy system which has a gross yield of 4 ATP, but it consumes 2 in the process. And so there's a net yield of 2 ATP. Not true. In exercising skeletal muscle, it's a net yield of 3 because you skip hexokinase largely. You largely skip hexokinase. Hexokinase consumes 1 ATP. Glycogen phosphorylase and phosphoglucomutase, those do not consume ATP. So that's why this stuff is important. Glycolysis, glucose versus glycogen. And lactic acid, sodium lactate, whatever you have when we see it in circulation. A little history of its culpability, right? So Margaria and colleagues, that was 1933, and just looking at the blood pH and blood lactate. Right, so let's get some lactate in the blood, and the pH is falling. Right, we're getting very acidic in the blood at the same time we see hydrogen ions appearing. I mean, really strong correlation, impressively perfect correlation. And so I do not fault these authors for this novel observation, and their conclusion that they drew from it follows. Right, that was really smart what they did. It was wrong, right? But there's a lot of wrong stuff that's super smart because they're figuring something out based on information and discovering things. And yeah, not every discovery is right away. Now, Solon, 1976, et al., Solon and colleagues, they looked at the same relationship, but in the muscle. So, and I'll show you the actual graph that Solon used, that he published. But as lactate accumulation occurs in muscle, not in the blood, but in muscle, pH falls. And so it's the same observation. Get Jeevers, right? So let's get into 1977, the very next year after Solon is Jeevers, 1977. And they just started questioning the conventional wisdom that had been around since the 30s. And sometimes you question conventional wisdom, right? It is size principle or something. Also 30s, a little bit later in the 30s, and then into the 50s with with Henneman, 57 with Henneman, 38 from the origins of size principle and his orderly recruitment, Pennybacker and Denny Brown. Sometimes you question conventional wisdom and say, oh, convention stands, right? We took an axe to it and couldn't chop down that tree. Size principle. Sometimes you question conventional wisdom, sort of the pH biochemistry of Margaria and Solon, brilliant people, and you're like, it turns out they were wrong. They were on the right track, but they were wrong. So Jeevers was the first person to do that. And remember Edward O. Adolph, when he was questioning general adaptation syndrome. Edward Adolph was questioning Hans Selye general adaptation syndrome, and he said something like, "It is widely supposed that adaptates overlap," and sort of all that stuff. Jeevers did something very similar. It is widely believed that, and then described the assumptions of lactate and of glycolysis and their effect on proton accumulation, on cytoplasmic and blood pH changes. And very much like what Edward Adolph did, and didn't have all of the facts in place, didn't have all of the biochem laid out, but did a good job of questioning that assumption, questioning that model, which led to Toffeletti, 91, starting to calculate a little bit more here and identifying that lactate is a consumer, not a producer of hydrogen ions. George Brooks, massive researcher on this from 80s and 90s and 2000s. I mean, he's a huge researcher on this subject. He's over at Berkeley. He's still at Berkeley. Roberts, best paper ever written on it, and I have some images of it. But this is the paper we talked about before, 2004, and the final paper on the fate of hydrogen ions and the calculation of them in glycolysis. And we no longer, once this paper came out, there's no excuse for saying, lactic acid is the cause of the burning sensation. Really, no excuse since the Roberts paper came out and just went step by step and said, "Nah, here's how it works." What does your central nervous system use for fuel? Glucose. It's not going to touch fat. Your central nervous system, that's not going to touch fat. That's going to be a glucose hungry machine. Now, ketones, sure, but carbs versus fat. Fat burns slowly. Your brain wants to consume it faster than that. How slow do you want to think? Good luck even getting the fat there, blood-brain barrier. Good luck getting it there. Oh, there's more free radicals. If we're going to be oxidative, let's talk free radicals. There's a lot of problems with fat as a fuel source for your central nervous system. Glucose doesn't have those problems, and so we need a bunch of glucose. And again, going back to this idea of glucose versus glycogen during exercise, we're glycogen consuming monsters, right? We try to hold back on glucose a little bit because we want to preserve that availability for the central nervous system. Lactic acidosis, tons of textbooks. You get into the 80s, some of the 90s. It's starting to be discarded. This idea of lactic acidosis, of this culprit of the pH change during exercise. Metabolic acidosis is what we're moving to. Now, this is the Roberts paper. So look it up, keep it, whatever. I'm talking about the most important points. Robert Roberts, Daryl Parker, he's just up in Sacramento. I don't know if he's still there, but the biochemistry of exercise-induced metabolic acidosis. Let's not talk about glycolysis doing it. This is page 506, R506, page 506, and the equation. So if you go from glucose and you're going to create your 2-pyruvate, right? You get one glucose, a little 6-carbon guy, and you're going to create 2 3-carbon pyruvates, you're going to get 2 hydrogen ions. Now, if you go from glycogen to pyruvate to 2 pyruvates, you're going to get 1 hydrogen ion because you skip hexokinase. Hexokinase works on glucose, and you have a ATP consumption there, which is why you only get 2 ATP down here, 2 ATP out of glucose as you go through hexokinase, which consumes ATP and releases a hydrogen ion. With glycogen, you don't use hexokinase, right? That's one road into glycolysis. You take the back road in, you take glycogen phosphorylase and phosphoglucomutase to chop off a little G1P, convert the G1P into G6P, and then you enter glycolysis past hexokinase. So you don't consume that hexokinase ATP, which is why if you go from glycogen, I think this is how, you get 3 ATP and 1 hydrogen ion because you skip hexokinase. Now, this is also from the Roberts paper. Now, once you get to pyruvate kinase, to create your pyruvate, consumes 2 hydrogen ions because you have 2 molecules. It's 2 3-carbon molecules. But then you got to do something with your pyruvate, right? Do you run it through aerobic metabolism? Do you convert to lactate? If you convert to lactate dehydrogenase, LDH, lactate dehydrogenase, you consume 2 more hydrogen ions. So if you've only produced 1 going from glycogen, as you go through glycolysis from glycogen, right, using glycogen phosphorylase and phosphoglucomutase, you don't consume any ATP there. That's metabolically free, and you don't release any hydrogen ions. You skip hexokinase if you use these 2, right? This is glycogen. This is glucose. And both of these roads take you to the exact same destination. They both converge on G6P, glucose 6-phosphate. But glucose releases a hydrogen ion and consumes 1 ATP. Glycogen does not. So if you go from glycogen to pyruvate, you've produced 1 hydrogen ion, pH, right? Accumulation of hydrogen ions, pH, hydrogen. If you convert to lactate, you consume 2. So you're at -1. So it becomes more basic, right? This is not acidifying. If you go from glucose to lactate, there's no change in your pH. There's no change at all in pH. Glycogen to lactate, which is what you're doing, right? Because you have like a pound of this stuff and you have like 4 grams of this. And if you just consume this in a hurry, you die. So we're consuming in the interest of survival and performance and survivable biology. We are consuming glycogen and we are not acidifying our tissue. So a nociceptor, when we create a bunch of hydrogen ions through metabolic acidosis, ATP hydrolysis, we hydrolyze that ATP, we chop off a phosphate, and the accumulation of hydrogen ions from that's really where we're getting the bulk of our hydrogen ions from. Now we're consuming ATP. We're consuming ATP from a lot of things. Myosin ATP during exercise. You were consuming ATP all over the place all the time. But during exercise, we're consuming ATP from multiple sources. These ATP ACEs, ASE, enzyme, ATPase for breaking down our ATP, myosin ATPase. That's most of it. The bulk of your ATP consumption in an exercising muscle is going to be from myosin ATPase for cross-bridge cycling. There's also that sarcoplasmic reticulum calcium ATPase, which is the pumping of calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticula, into a reticulum or the reticula, plural, and maybe a quarter of your ATP, something like that, maybe a quarter, somewhere around there, is the sarcoplasmic reticulum calcium ATPase, and then also your sodium potassium pump. You have to keep those ions going where they belong. I don't know, maybe 10%, something like that, of your ATP consumption, but the bulk of your muscle ATP consumption, this is the myosin ATPase. And you generate all these hydrogen ions. Nociceptors detect those things. Pain fibers are going to detect those things. Remember the Gansfeld procedure where the ping pong balls, this halved ping pong balls put over your eyes, and you try to just eliminate all sources of stimuli, visual and audible and palpable and whatever. Don't be eating food at the time and whatever. The Gansfeld procedure, and then you just started. The nerves hate silence. That's all we're illustrating here. Is the nerves don't like having nothing to do. You got to give them something to do. If you have neuropathic pain, like nerve related problems, which tons of people have at night, man, it hurts. Like it's just like the world is the most painful thing at night. But like during the day, while I'm lecturing, there's not much pain. Is as soon as distractions go to sleep, oh man, like nerves. It's like, okay, I need something to do. I need something to do. So how about you have some pain? You know what pH is? The scale, right? It's 0 to 14. 7 is neutral. 0, super acidic. 14, super basic. 7 is just like nothing. It's in the middle. Metabolic acidosis, you know what that is. Met value, metabolic equivalence of the task. If you're exercising, I don't know what that's what he's doing. He may be doing some weird, like, you know, 1880s stretch on a machine. It looks like 1880s technology or something. Uh, let's say he's doing prone leg curls though, and he's just curling his legs over and over in his suit. He's going through ATP hydrolysis, the largest source of metabolic byproducts, ATP hydrolysis, and the bulk of that is your myosin ATPase. Now, you're going to get a bunch of hydrogen ions being released. We're also going to talk about the phosphates and the ADP. We talked about this one on Monday, but these are the met values. Just multiply your basal metabolism times this, right? If you're killing some pheasants, grouse, I don't know what that is. That's a 6-fold increase in your metabolism, ballpark figure. If you're hiking with hunting gear, you're not killing yet, you're just hiking. You're 9.5 times your resting metabolism. If you're just like standing there shooting a pistol, maybe 2.5 times your resting metabolism. All of this stuff, you're generating a bunch of hydrogen ions. You do it enough, and you're going to get acidified. Any realistic truth to implementing baking soda water to reduce exercise hydrogen? Yes, there is. I will show you today. I will show you the experiment. Now, for the baking soda, sodium bicarbonate, or you can use calcium bicarbonate, some sort of bicarbonate to absorb these hydrogen ions. Now, I don't know what effect it's going to have in the muscle, right? But in the blood, certainly in the stomach. So a lot of people, you're going to eat it, right? You put it in your mouth, and the first place this goes is your stomach, and your stomach is very acidic. And so a lot of people get this gastrointestinal discomfort. And I ran a study. I had an IRB approved study that I would never publish because this was an undergraduate experiment. And so I had a study where I got approval from my undergraduate institution IRB to run a baking soda study, like just Arm and Hammer, have a bunch of it. And this guy Chad, he was a football player. I mean, he weighed like 240 or 260 or something. And you ingest baking soda proportionate to your weight, to your body weight. And so he ate a lot, and it was serial testing under the Wingate, 30 seconds all out sprint. And he did his first test, started vomiting in his lap, and you have to do the second test like 2 minutes later. And I made him do a second test covered in vomit, and I was trying to hold back my own vomit. He didn't perform very well in his second test, and so that ruined the output. That ruined the ergogenic effect of it. But if you handle it well, if you tolerate it well, there are specific exercise conditions at which baking soda can work. It just tastes like, if you just eat baking soda by itself and like a lot of it, just take a big tablespoon of it, put it in your mouth and go exercise. And it tastes like you're out in the middle of the ocean surrounded by dead sardines, and it's just stuff is falling in your mouth and it's just salty and disgusting. I mean, it really tastes bad. And then go exercise really hard right after that. I knew people that would do this before our conditioning test. Yeah, it's there's effectiveness to it. There's effectiveness to it, and I'm going to make a point out of that soon. And some lecture, some semesters I cover different stuff in muscle phys. Some semesters I do a very thorough, like 3 or 4 lectures in a row of just supplements. Let's just talk about supplements and how they work and sort of the biochemistry of what's going on. We talked about some supplements, just the stuff that interacts with mTOR. It's phosphatidic acids, HMB, it's leucine, lysine, arginine, whatever. We talked about arachidonic acid. We just really talked about stuff that deals with mTOR. This isn't an mTOR thing. We didn't get into it this semester because I decided to focus more on mTOR and less on some of the other stuff. And when it came down to what should I do at the end of the semester, there's like 3 or 4 options. And so I decided to do burning and fatigue and the physiology of why you stop exercising, as opposed to let's go through supplements one by one. So sometimes some semesters I'll do baking soda and stuff in detail, but those hydrogen ions, these things matter. These things really matter. And just what the pH scale is. Super acidic over here. Your blood and spit and tears and whatever is over here, and milk and super basic over here. So what's the pH of these sweet little babies? You made babies cry. That's what you did today. That was your accomplishment, is you made all these babies weep and like fire. I mean, look at this one's bright red, and they're all crying. And what are their tears like as they're crying? Maybe 7.1, something like that, for the pH of these little baby tears. The nervous system, though, we detect our pH. We detect these hydrogen ions, right? We have this. And we're going to detect the little hydrogen ions here. Now we detect tons of stuff, right? The bradykinins and prostaglandins, tons of stuff is going to be detected. But hydrogen ions, that's a big one. And that's your muscle burning is where you're going to detect. Now, that was our echoing of the burning. So fatigue, remember the big picture stuff, of fatigue. Jesse, again, thank you for the comment. mTOR was awesome. I think mTOR is one of the most important things that I can teach for muscle physiology because it's the foundation of how we respond. Are we trying to grow? Are we trying to shrink? Are we trying to heal? Are we trying to make our enemies decay? There are ways to enact these things, and most people do it totally wrong. And if you know the map, if you know all of the routes that you take, take a left on 99, and if you hit the Shell station, you've gone too far. If you know how to navigate the course, you're going to be 20 times as effective as a physical therapist. You will be 50 times as effective as a personal trainer. You will be whether you're working with family, you're working with friends, you're working with clients or patients, you're working whatever it is. It's like the most effective. It's the most useful thing in terms of skeletal muscle adaptations. And so I wanted to do more than justice to it. I wanted to do practically injustice at the level of detail. And so, okay, so the big picture causes of fatigue, one of them, how much calcium gets released. You need calcium to get out there. You need calcium to depart the sarcoplasmic reticulum. You need a big exodus of calcium so it can bind to the troponin C. It actually does need to bind, right, to the troponin C. So how sensitive the muscle is to calcium, because stuff can mess that up. And then how much force the cross bridges are making, stuff can mess that up too. Remember, we talked about ADP. You generate a bunch of ADP and you have a harder time releasing that ADP. And so you're messing up the cross bridges themselves. And then central fatigue, and that's going to be on Friday before we do um, our case studies. We'll do central fatigue. So all of these different mechanisms of fatigue, right? We have Mr. Trebek quizzing us on these things. So ATP, ADP ratio, RIP. I know. Yeah, I'm reading the comments. Yeah, recently I like. He was so good in interviews too. If you watch interviews of sort of, I don't know, like Tom Green level, if you don't know who that is, which you probably don't, and I think you probably shouldn't know who it is, but that sort of fake interview where somebody comes up and tries to catch you, or like Ashton Kutcher's like punked thing, and where they like, you can't, he was just too smart and compassionate and clever. And like, it was just funny watching people like try to catch him in an interview or something. Like, no, he's way too smart. He sees through this. Come on. And so the comments that are appearing in the chat box, I agree with all of them. So anyway, ATP ADP ratio, super important in terms of managing your fatigue and explaining why it's there. Hydrogen ion, super important for the burning sensation, and we're going to talk about that today as a cause of fatigue. And I don't really buy it as a cause of cellular fatigue. As a cause of central fatigue, maybe, yeah, probably. Phosphates are important. It's seemingly a very important cause of cellular fatigue. And then the rest of these, because all three of these just come from ATP hydrolysis. These are your ADP, hydrogen ion, and phosphate. That's just like consume ATP and you get these things. So these should be markers of fatigue because you're burning through your energy reserves, and you need to know when you're getting close to an overdraft fee in your bank, right? When your bank account is low, you want an acknowledgement. Hey, just a heads up. If your bank sends you like a text to say, hey, are these withdraws real or something? It's that sort of warning where your bank sends you a warning, and your body has to send you those warnings too. Hey, just letting you know the energy reserves are getting low, so knock off whatever the hell you're doing. And then magnesium, reactive oxygen species. I'm not going to do justice to this one, or local inflammation, because they're weird and messy. And just like, we did a lot of inflammation earlier in sections 3 and 2. Section 2 to talk about what it looks like in the presence of injury or tissue damage, even just exercise induced tissue damage, inflammatory, what goes on. We talked about that in section 2. We talked about in section 3 for healing. Right now in section 3, I introduced this idea of reactive oxygen species, like free radicals with oxygen in it, peroxynitrite and superoxide, and so you just have oxygen you have like an unpaired electron. But I said it's sort of weird with mTOR and how it activates and deactivates, and there's some stuff IL-6 that we didn't really talk about with mTOR. I'll mention today. It gets weird with mTOR. Let's turn it on and off. Kind of like how Deptor turns off. It's an inhibitor of mTOR, but it also inhibits apoptosis and sort of these weird multi-personality cells and fats and proteins and whatever. So we'll do injustice to reactive oxygen species and local inflammation, just to talk about that they are mechanisms of fatigue. But that stuff's weird. Structural damage to tissues, very simple. I'll give you 2 slides on that. That's just ridiculous. Generation of heat, we'll talk about that, and carbohydrate availability. We've already done the tryptophan and serotonin one. Central fatigue is going to be for Friday, but we'll sort of fly through a lot of this stuff. If you have low ATP, if your ATP levels are low, you need ATP as a resource for your ATPases, and so you need to consume ATP. So if you get low, potentially you have some problems. Remember, there's a sarcoplasmic reticulum calcium ATPase. There's also those sodium potassium pumps. Those ATPases. And so if you're losing ATP, especially here, not especially everywhere, but here, if you're looking at this sort of electrical issues of maintenance of, think rate coding, right? The frequency of firing, you need regulation. You need really tight regulation of these things. And if you, like a refractory period in heart, in a heart muscle, the refractory period is like a quarter of a second. I mean, it's really long. That's why your heart rate isn't 800. But in skeletal muscle, it's like 1 or 2 milliseconds. I mean, it's really brief. So you get this effect of a very consistent contraction, this sort of like permaflex. And if you've ever been to a fencing tournament or watched one on YouTube or something like that, you just hear beep like the whole time. It's just beeps during the peak periods because every time you get a touch, it beeps, right? So if you are, it looks like this is Zepe. But every time you like depress the little end button, it beeps and it's a beep. But that's all it does. But there's like 100 people fencing at once, and so it's sort of uninterrupted. And that's sort of what it's like in skeletal muscle. It's a really bad analogy, but it's like beep, and so you get this constant sort of tetanus, constant contraction, at least behaviorally. But it's a series of action potentials. And you just need this regulation to be. If you want function, you need regulation. And so the ATP, as we're pumping ions where they belong, we need to release, we need to repack. All of this stuff needs to be really tightly regulated. But then ADP builds up, and remember, this is a slide from last lecture. At rest, muscle at rest is going to be pretty low. But I mean, you can get this thing, 10, 20 times its resting levels during intense exercise. And a lot of functions are going to be compromised in the presence of elevated ADP. Calcium, the sarcoplasmic reticulum gets a little bit leaky. The dump might be compromised. That sort of exodus of calcium, and then the ATP ADP ratio on the ryanodine receptor. Remember, this is the thing that you depart from is that ryanodine receptor. ADP, not a very good doorman. ATP, a much better doorman, but it's just competing for who gets the job. So what I said in the last lecture was the large neutral amino acid transporters, ratios of things determine so much in the body, and having more ATP makes them function a little bit better. And then the release of ADP, I mentioned that one a couple minutes ago, but if you build up a lot of ADP, sliding filament theory, you have to release that thing so you can get a new ATP to bind, so you can transition to a weak bond state and detach, and then hydrolyze ATP and redo crossbridge cycling or sliding filament theory. How do you slide? You have to go through the cycling for actinomyosin, those filaments of sliding filament theory. And so the release of ADP can limit the velocity if you accumulate a ton of this stuff. And then just remember the ammonia. This can cross the blood-brain barrier. So if you're doing a bunch of activity, you go through that adenylate kinase reaction. So two ADPs, you take from one and give to the other, and your ATP and AMP, and then AMP deaminase. You're going to create ammonia and IMP, inosine monophosphate. That ammonia, if you build up too much of that, can cross the blood-brain barrier and get a one proposed mechanism of central fatigue. So that cerebral uptake of ammonia. So these are all ATP, ADP. We talked about those before. These, whatever, you have all of those. Now, so that's the ATP ADP ratio. We've also done tryptophan and serotonin. And at the end of today, I'll have one slide and I'll just remind you of what that is, since it was just like a week and a half ago when we did it. It was pre-Thanksgiving. So let's do that hydrogen ion next. pH. I mean, it depends what you're doing. At rest, your blood and your muscle, slightly different pH for these at rest as opposed to during exercise. And so there's your strenuous exercise, there's your at rest, blood versus blood, muscle versus muscle. We fall. pH goes down. We accumulate hydrogen ions. pH goes down. And this is in the muscle. This is that Solon one from 1976, and so we see it's around 7, something like that. And as it accumulates, as muscle lactate and pyruvate are accumulating from exercise intensity, we're accumulating these things. We see the muscle pH falling. So we're up here resting, and go exercise, and you're going to see pH going down, 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 down. So that is your inside of the muscle, which is really what's important in terms of performance, is inside of the muscle. I don't really care too much about my blood. If I'm working a bicep, arm, leg, wherever, if I'm working a bicep, I don't really care about the blood. Let's say I'm working like I'm doing like bicep curls. I'm all upstairs, upper body, brachii, right? And I don't care about the blood that's, hanging out, that's pooling in my calves. I don't care what the pH is there. It doesn't really have an effect on my muscle. The intramuscular pH matters. Now, maybe it matters for central fatigue. So maybe blood pH is a critical ingredient for the brain's interpretation of exercise intensity, energy substrate availability, and oxygen availability. And maybe there's a lot of inputs being communicated to the brain, and your central nervous system says, okay, blood pH, I'm going to go ahead and shut down the bicep. So I'm not saying it's a complete story, the intramuscular pH, and who cares about blood pH. Because when you start looking at something like baking soda as an ergogenic aid, like, it's not really going to my exercise and muscle. I mean, it's affecting my stomach, and then it's affecting my blood. And like, what does that really have to do with my skeletal muscle? But there's a bigger picture when we start looking at central governor theory. Now, protons, hydrogen ions, protons can be detected by nociceptors, and that burns. Most of us have felt that, and some of us feel it regularly. And once upon a time, it was considered maybe not the chief cause of cellular fatigue, but in a cast of chieftains, one of the kind of rulers of fatigue. But I'm not talking about lactate. When we're talking about pH as a cause of cellular fatigue, nothing about lactate. That's not what I'm talking about, because the difference between lactate and pH. I mean, this is a buffer. The lactate is a buffer. People take it as a supplement. It doesn't work very well. But when you look at the different supplements that people will take to as acid buffers, as pH buffers, yeah, the bicarbonate is going to be the most effective, and lactate is probably the least effective. But there are studies that evaluate lactate as a buffer. People take it as a supplement. Again, it doesn't work very well. And so that's not what I'm talking about. Lactate is not harmful. pH, accumulation of hydrogen ions, sure, maybe this is harmful. And so again, we know ATPase here. This is ATP hydrolysis. We see the hydrogen ion being released because we have an O and an H from water plugging up that phosphate, because we chop the phosphate off. Right, we got a little O and an H plugging it up. And where does that come from? Water. What happens to the other H? That's your pH. That's the H of your pH, is this guy right here from your water. So in the presence of a bunch of protons, hydrogen ions, protons, right? There's no electron there. In the presence of a bunch of protons, there's a few proposals. Don't take any of these too seriously, but there's some proposals. So the sarcoplasmic reticulum, this can be affected a little bit, and then the contractile unit itself, in a couple of ways, is proposed to be affected. And the major one, people would talk about, yeah, there's an engagement between actin and myosin itself that's been talked about, but the major one for number two is um, calcium and troponin C, the ability to bind for the calcium to the troponin C. But let's start with this one. Let's start with the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So as calcium leaves, this positively charged ion, right? As this thing leaves, and you have your dihydropyridine receptor activated, which, so the depolarization induced calcium release, so that you go through your ranitidine receptor, you're leaking out calcium, you get your calcium induced calcium. You dump a bunch of calcium out, hydrogen ions are going to sneak in. Those things are going to go inside of the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Now, under normal conditions, it's fine. When it's time to pump the calcium back in, you get the hydrogen ions back out. But in vigorous exercise, you're burning, right? You're doing intervals of the wind gauge or sprints or really like a 400-meter set of lunges or something like that. That's not normal conditions. And so you might get a little bit of sort of ionic problem with just too many hydrogen ions hanging out in there. The accumulation, pumping back in of the calcium into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, that can slow down. You can impair that a little bit, and then the release of calcium that might also be affected on subsequent contractions. Maybe the release of calcium. That's pretty much it. It doesn't seem to be all that potent. The calcium induced calcium release, as opposed to depolarization induced calcium release. Proton accumulation, it does not affect the depolarization induced calcium release, right? If you go from all the way up north in your primary motor cortex and you cross the neuromuscular junction and hit that dihydropyridine receptor, that doesn't really seem to be affected, but the calcium induced calcium release that happens after the depolarization induced calcium release, there seems to be a little bit of an effect there. And the caffeine induced release, sure. Now, blocking of the contractile unit, this was what people said for a really long time, really long time. I mean, let's go back to like the Nixon administration and Gerald Ford administrations. I mean, let's get back into the 70s, and then kind of get into the 80s. And this is what people used to say, is that there's a competitive inhibition of uh, the hydrogen ions and the calcium binding sites on troponin C. And so a bunch of hydrogen ions are going to prevent the calcium from binding. So that was the claim for a long time, which said these hydrogen ions, this pH within the muscle, the intracellular pH change, is really affecting sliding filament theory, cross-bridge cycling, because of this little mechanism. It doesn't really seem to be true, but even in the 1990s, there's this article that says, fast, slow twitch fibers, if you get the pH reduced from 7 to 6.2. From 7 to 6.2, you reduce that pH, and we're seeing performance deterioration. So pH directly modulates the strength of the bond formed between actin and myosin. That's the other one. It's not necessarily the troponin C explanation, but in cross-bridge cycling, the troponin C and the bond between actin and myosin. I mean, we're in 1990, and that's still a commonly held position. Fast forward into the 21st century, just 2001, right into the onset of the 21st century, and I start questioning a lot of this pH change and skeletal muscle fatigue. It doesn't really seem to hold up when you do these validation studies and you start testing these things. Like, I'm not really seeing it anymore. And this study right here from 2017, it has a nice little summary. So, the accumulation of hydrogen ions lowers the pH, right? Notice the repetition of H here. This is what the H is. Potentially interfering with the sarcoplasmic reticulum calcium release. We talked about that one, those hydrogen ions sneak in. Troponin C sensitivity to calcium. We talked about that one, that competitive inhibition. That was that sort of big one for a long time. And cross-bridge cycling, resulting in impaired muscle force. That was that last one we talked about. So there's a few mechanisms proposed, but it just doesn't. You start looking at this stuff in the future, and you don't see it. You don't really see fatigue. You do see burning. You do see burning, but you don't see the cellular mechanisms, the cellular explanations of fatigue. Not necessarily central. There may be an explanation for central, but even at the, take this slide with huge grain of salt, just as gleaming grain of sort of unground salt. And the hydrogen ions, what they seem to inhibit, the reloading of the reticulum more than they would inhibit in the troponin C. And so you might actually have more calcium in the cell, in the presence of a bunch of hydrogen ions. And so if anything, it's possible it's actually helpful. I don't think it is. Right? Again, a grain of, let's say, Morton seasoning salt. Take it with a grain of that. But There are interactions. All I'm trying to get across here is there are interactions with that hydrogen ion, but they don't seem to impair performance, the hydrogen ion. Central fatigue, though, one explanation for the enhancement of centrally mediated activation is nerves. I mean, this whole thing, muscle contraction, it begins in the nerves and then it goes down the T tubules, hits the dihydropyridine receptor. This is all electrical. This is an electrical event beginning in the brain. If it's the alpha motor nerve, if it's like gamma or something, well, who cares? But yeah, alpha motor nerve. Let's begin in the brain and uh, get down the T tubules. It's a big electrical event. Now, if you impair that electrical activity, you impair muscle activation. If you promote that electrical activity, you promote muscle activation. Now, charge gradients, we know these charge gradients of things where we have this influx of sodium, these voltage gated channels, the influx of sodium, we have these refractory periods afterward, where the cell is trying to recover. But what we want is to hit this -70 or so, this resting membrane potential. And if it drops down to like -90, it's harder to recruit that cell. You remember this stuff from the first block. Harder to recruit this cell if it's in a relative refractory period. Absolute refractory period, you just have to wait for this stuff to reopen, to recover before you can do it again. But again, this is milliseconds, like 1 or 2 milliseconds in a skeletal muscle cell. Again, a heart, you're looking. I mean, this is like the heart refractory period just goes and goes and goes off the slide. I mean, it's a quarter of a second. So really short refractory period, absolute refractory period in skeletal muscle, and then this follow-up relative refractory period. Now, it's not just sodium potassium. Earlier this semester, I mentioned chloride. At rest, chloride conductance is responsible for a lot of the charge. I don't know how much. Numbers that get reported in the literature are like 80%, but a grain of something, a grain of hash with that one. So these numbers that get reported, who cares? But the idea that matters is that chloride can affect membrane potential. And so during exercise, right, we have muscles losing potassium. So this is where we're walking through how hydrogen ions could potentially help electrical activation of cells. So it's warding off fatigue. As pH lowers, hydrogen ions accumulate, you're warding off fatigue. Muscle cells are losing, you're just leaking out this potassium. It's positively charged, right? So you're just leaking out potassium. Potassium is positively charged. You're getting more negative. This is not helpful. This is not helpful because you're getting more and more negative. Think relative refractory period. Maybe there's a cause of fatigue there. Maybe. I don't know. I've never seen an explanation of how this is a major cause of fatigue during exercise, but the excitability of the cell lowers, think relative refractory period. Action potentials, right? We need a larger and larger excitatory stimulus. Our type 1 fibers may as well be type 2s, right? A larger excitatory stimulus at this point for them. But if there's an intracellular within the cell buildup of hydrogen ions, that doesn't affect the potassium loss. You're going to continue to lose the potassium, but those T tubules, sort of that last lap, the sort of last little like runway of the race, these become less permeable to chloride. Now, chloride is negatively charged, so chloride is not going to seep in. If that negatively charged thing in the presence of a bunch of hydrogen ions, if that negatively charged guy, chloride, stops leaking in to the cell, into the T tubules, the charge stops falling so much, and your relative refractory period is not as severe. So you don't dip down and make it harder to recruit the muscle on subsequent contractions. So maybe there's something there. Okay, maybe. So less inhibition is tantamount to more excitability. I don't know how potent this is. It's probably not a very big deal, right? It probably doesn't contribute very much, but there's maybe something there. So does that mean, because we don't really see a cellular mechanism for fatigue of the hydrogen ions, you explore these things in detail, get into the 21st century, and we're not really seeing any cellular effects of hydrogen ions causing fatigue. And here's a mechanism, a proposed mechanism of how this limited chloride conductance, how it can improve the electrical activity. So we think central fatigue. Does that mean the hydrogen ions are good? If we want to perform, they're warding off fatigue, right? The lower your pH, the more hydrogen ions you accumulate, the better it is. Well, no, because that's why baking soda, where this conversation began with that question at the sort of beginning of the lecture. So baking soda, we see the ergogenic effects of sodium bicarbonate. I mean, you can go get your Arm& Hammer or whatever, get calcium bicarbonate, who cares? Get some sort of bicarbonate. And it does work. It does work. And so why does it work though? If you're just buffering a bunch of hydrogen ions, and we don't really have a good mechanism to point to, a good how, a good mechanism to say, oh, that's why, right, that we are taking our baking soda. It's because those hydrogen ions are doing this to the sarcoplasmic reticula, or they're doing this to the troponin C, or they're doing this to the actin myosin bond, or they're doing this to whatever it is. We don't really have a good mechanism, but this stuff works. It works. So there's something going on. And I don't really buy any of the explanations. I'm not saying the explanations are invalid. They don't seem good. They don't seem too believable to me. There's just too many holes in them. And so maybe all that's going on is central governor theory. That is your brain recognizing it, but there may be something cellular going on too. And I'm not smart enough to see it. I haven't identified it. It's the eye of Sauron hasn't found it yet, right? It's looking across the landscape, and it just hasn't found anything. I guess I'm Sauron here. So the summary of the proton concentrations, right, hydrogen ion or proton concentrations, it's maybe there's some sarcoplasmic reticulum stuff, right? When those hydrogen ions leak into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and that can muck up the behavior a little bit, the reloading and the subsequent dump. Maybe the contractile unit itself can be obstructed, whether that's troponin C competition or it's engagement between actin and myosin. Maybe something like that is going on. Sure, maybe. I don't really buy it, but the action potential does seem to be a little bit easier to achieve owing to chloride. I don't think it's all that big of a deal. I think there's other stuff going on with the hydrogen ion that is sort of unacknowledged. It is a cause of fatigue, but probably central, but maybe some other stuff. If it wasn't a cause of fatigue, we just wouldn't see these supplements working, these pH buffer supplements working. So there must be something. Phosphates, we know what's going on with the phosphates, or at least we know a fair amount. Maybe there's more to it, but at rest, phosphates, and you know where the phosphates come from, ATP hydrolysis. At rest, you got a few millimoles of these things. During vigorous exercise, maybe you get a tenfold increase, something like that, as you're really going at it. But if you're lying in your snuggy sleeping bag thing, you're pretty low. This can build up quite a bit during vigorous exercise. And the timing signature, you can identify mm, potential mechanisms of fatigue based on the timing signature of its arrival, how it manifests. And so an early cause of fatigue, the earliest cause of, like very early cause of fatigue, this is going to be electrical. I mean, this is like type 2 fiber saying no thanks. Now, late fatigue can be central also, can be nervous system also. And we talked about tryptophan and serotonin and the serotonin metabolism, and that's central fatigue. And that's like at the end of a marathon, you can experience that one. And so central fatigue can arrive very early. Size principle, just say, nah, no thanks. I give you 5 reps on this bench. I'm done. Where you just have these nerves checking out. But after that, like a very early sort of electrical fatigue, impairment of the cross bridges seems to be a little bit. That's on the early side, right? That's on the if fatigue is setting in sort of an anaerobic resistance training sense, that's probably the cause, that and electrical. Just remember with the phosphates, remember how ADP causes causes fatigue. It's hard to release it. If you create this huge surplus of ADP, you don't release it as effectively. And so if you don't release the ADP, it's hard to transition to rebind an ATP. It's hard to transition into a weak bond state. So the cycling, the cross-bridge cycling gets delayed, gets a little bit impaired. So the same thing happens with phosphates. You have to release your phosphate. Right now it's different. Releasing your phosphates is a little bit different because you transition to the strong bond. If you can't release your phosphate, or if you're delaying the release of your phosphate, if you're impairing the release of your phosphate, if you're just reducing it a little bit, then you can't transition to the strong bond, because the strong bond state, remember, weak bond is ATP or ADP and the phosphate. And so you have to release that phosphate. That's the thing that happens first. And what Patrick asked a while ago about, would we want a ton of ADP for a long isometric hold? It's the opposite. It's certainly the opposite for phosphates, where isometric holds are really impaired by a high concentration of phosphates. Again, I just means inorganic. This is how you're going to see it. There's no carbon in it. There's no like hydrocarbon bond here. So you see this of you can go higher than this, right? But this is a pretty big increase in phosphates, but you can definitely go higher. But over here is isometric, right? And start moving faster and faster and faster, and this elevation of phosphates is it impairs performance less. But isometric, man, that's terrible for that. And so sort of unable to transition into the strong bond state is what that one does. And so that is also a cause of fatigue. And remember, the chloride and the sarcoplasmic reticulum, you have chloride channels, and those are permeable, and chloride, those are permeable to your phosphates. Now, if your ATP gets very low, you don't just have like phosphates running in there, roughhousing whenever they feel like it. But if your ATP levels get low, phosphates can squeeze through those channels and get inside of the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and they can bind to the calcium in there. So if a phosphate gets inside of the sarcoplasmic reticulum and binds to the phosphate, you get this like precipitate, this calcium phosphate precipitate, whatever they call it. That becomes a problem because you don't release it. When you have this activation of the cell, if you have all this bound calcium and with phosphates, it doesn't get released on this subsequent contraction where you should be doing a bunch of dumping. So the free calcium that gets released is limited. You're getting less calcium released, and so the subsequent contraction is a little bit weaker. You just have less calcium to bind to the troponin C if you have all those phosphates in there. Now, most of your calcium is bound. You have calsequestrin. This thing binds like 50 calciums to it, but it binds it very weakly. This is inside of your sarcoplasmic reticulum. You're binding your calcium to calsequestrin, but it's just like you must have been on like a terrible date where you're just looking for any excuse to get out of there. Like this person's asking you, like, "What's your favorite color?" or whatever. Like, I can't do this anymore. And you're just looking for an escape. That's calsequestrin. It's not clingy. You're waiting for your phone to ring. You're waiting for, it looks like they're like a bowling alley or something, and you're just waiting for like, oh, your shoes are up or something, and ready to go. That's calsequestrin. It's not clingy. Now, phosphates, these are like, bridle. You're much more wedded here. It's clingy. You don't get to get released with it. So as you get a bunch of phosphates in there, it's harder to release free calcium. And so that can be a major effect of fatigue. It does take a little bit of time for this to happen. ATP hydrolysis has to be running for a while. You have to get your ATP low before the phosphates start sneaking in. But when your ATP is low, you're gonna have a ton of phosphates already. So it's not like my ATP is low, but I don't have phosphate. Well, that's where you get your phosphates from, is consuming a bunch of ATP. But it just takes a little bit of time to get there. And so maybe 90 seconds or something like that. What sort of event is 90 seconds? Like, let's say you're doing an 800, and you are in your second lap, And like, oh, yeah, some phosphates are messing up your skeletal muscle contraction. Those phosphates are messing up your calcium release. They're messing up how much calcium you have available to bind to troponin C. So that's like you started the second lap of your 800 or however much longer, but you're like pushing it. It's like, oh, I'm 800 meters into my marathon. Yeah, but you're not pushing it. So it's different. And so, caffeine is going to enhance the rate of calcium release also, but that's probably just the effect that phosphates have on impairing the caffeine induced release is probably just from the precipitate. Now, none of that is absolutely you know proven where all the details are worked out, and all right, this is the timing and this is exactly how it happens, and but there's a lot of experiments that have demonstrated that effect, and so that's one you can rely on, that's one you can count on with a tiny grain, right? A grain of you run the salt through the coffee grinder for an hour, and like the tiniest little dust grain. There's a grain of salt with it still because the details are still being worked out, but it's pretty sound. That one is pretty well established. So that's phosphates. So at the end of ATP hydrolysis, right, we have ADP, we have phosphates, we have a hydrogen ion. Hydrogen ion, definitely burning, definitely burning. Maybe fatigue, yeah, probably some fatigue. My hunch is that's going to be central. Not my absolute position that I'll never change my mind, but my hunch is it's a lot of centrally mediated fatigue. The phosphate, I doubt there's any pain being caused by the phosphate, any of that burning, but definitely causing fatigue. There's mechanisms here, and even if it's just like, well, there's a cellular explanation, but really, what's going on is the brain is just interpreting information and giving executive orders to shut down. Even if that is the phosphates would still be an executive order. So this is definitely a cause of fatigue, and my hunch is I'll let you make up your mind of is it 100% central and all the cellular stuff is just who cares about, or is it a combination of central and cellular, which is my assumption is that fatigue is a combination of central and cellular. The ADP, definitely fatigue. I don't know, maybe there's a little bit of pain, and if we're looking at the adenine pool, it's we know the ATP is a neurotransmitter. Damaged tissue, you're going to release it. So maybe there's some mechanism of pain there, but who cares? Definitely fatigue with ADP. Definitely fatigue with phosphates. Sure, fatigue with hydrogen ions, and definitely pain with this one though. But these two are the big fatiguers, and this is the big pain inducer. General timing, cross bridge impairment early. So if something is messing up the cross bridges, that usually happens early. This is very vague, very general. And again, very, very early, off the slide to the left is going to be central. And also very, very delayed is going to be central, off the slide to the right. Central's all over the place, but for cellular stuff, we're thinking early cross bridge impairment, a little bit later sarcoplasmic reticulum calcium release for the central stuff. So that gets us through ATP hydrolysis. Those are the three byproducts of it, and probably the three major components of fatigue. We've done tryptophan, we'll do central fatigue next time, and we'll just burn through these for the rest of the class. Now, magnesium, you have about a protein scoop worth of magnesium in your body. If you get like a whey protein powder, a scoop is like 22 grams of protein or whatever, that's about how much magnesium you have in your body. And about a fifth of that is in your skeletal muscle. That's where it lives. And your ATP, a lot of it, a lot of your ATP, most of it is complexed with magnesium. It's magnesium ATP, it's complexed, and ADP, AMP, these have less of an affinity with the magnesium. And there are some fundamental differences with the magnesium in how it behaves as you're going through ATP hydrolysis. I don't really care about that stuff. What's important is the free magnesium, where again, ADP, AMP, IMP, inosine monophosphate, right? That's the AMP deaminase one. These have a lower affinity with your magnesium. Each one of these. So you go through ATP hydrolysis and you're increasing the amount of free magnesium that you have. And so this will increase free magnesium at rest pretty low. You can double it, you can triple it if you're doing really vigorous exercise for a long time, if you're altering your ATP to ADP and AMP ratio, maybe you can get up to triple, something like that. But what's going to happen is the sarcoplasmic reticulum, right? You are going to compromise the release in calcium-induced calcium release at the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Free magnesium, right? This is going to affect the ranitidine receptors, but the major thing is this one, where you're competing with the calcium binding sites for calcium-induced calcium release, not the depolarization induced calcium release, but the calcium induced calcium release from the ranitidine receptors. And so it's this competitive inhibition. Remember that subsequent dump? Jay, I've talked about a couple of times this lecture already, where you're going from the dihydropyridine receptors, that's depolarization induced calcium release, and then you release a little bit of calcium. That calcium binds to the ranitidine receptors, and when it does, you get calcium induced calcium release. But if you're competing for those binding sites with magnesium, because you've gone through a bunch of ATP hydrolysis and you've reduced your ATP levels, let's say you're 80%, 70%, 60%, something like that, ATP levels, then remember you can get down to like 20% of your resting ATP levels, but whole muscle value, you're only going to get down to about 80%. But you are going to have competitive inhibition of calcium-induced calcium release. So free magnesium, inhibitory, not as inhibitory as ATP ADP ratio or phosphates, but it does affect the release of, of calcium from calcium-induced calcium release. So that's magnesium. Reactive oxygen species. I'm going to do some serious injustice to this thing, but your antioxidants. We take antioxidants. It's vitamin C, it's vitamin E, whatever. This is a water soluble one. Vitamin E is a fat soluble one. So you can get into like a phospholipid bilayer if you're vitamin E. But we are combating free radical damage with these. And so a free radical, a reactive oxygen species, these things just have an unpaired electron. Now, vitamin C, antioxidant, right? I mean, the reason there's like bats and us, like vitamin C is vital for us because we can't synthesize it. Neither can bats, neither can guinea pigs, which guinea pigs are not from New Guinea, right? They're from like Peru and they're like the Andes, and they're not pigs either. Although the German name for guinea pigs is like little ocean pig, or so everyone calls them a pig, but they're neither from New Guinea nor are they a pig. But none of these creatures can us bats, guinea pigs can synthesize our own vitamin C, and so we have to take it. But what do these things do? They inhibit the oxidation of molecules, and so just transfer of electron. If you have an unpaired electron, again, I'm going to do injustice here. I just want to get to the decent part, the good part, where if you have an unpaired electron, you sort of throw this little hissy fit of things. And let's skip a bunch of this. And we're still skipping. And so, okay, so metabolism and reactive oxygen species. The electron transport chain, this from 129, after the Krebs cycle, you get the electron transport chain. And if you prematurely leak electrons, oxygen is that terminal acceptor. If you prematurely leak electrons, you can get free radicals. You get superoxide there. That's what this is. You get superoxide there. And it's going to bounce around, messing up stuff, throwing its a little hissy fit. And so this is really what we're taking our antioxidants for, but it also is going to have an effect on fatigue. Now, during vigorous exercise, you're going to create a bunch more of these things. So the reason I have UPS here, my brother used to work for UPS a long time ago. We were like undergrad age, and Christmas came. It's December 12th and 13th and 15th and 20th. And as it got closer and closer, he's working at the end of this conveyor belt. Think of a conveyor belt like the electron transport chain. And so he's at the end of this conveyor belt, and he's supposed to take these boxes and load them into trucks, load them into the delivery trucks. and it's just ridiculous. Like he's at the end of this box, at the end of this conveyor belt, and there's like 50 boxes at a time are coming. It's like, I'm a person. How am I supposed to get that? And it's how I feel at work when I get like 1,000 emails in a week. Like, how am I supposed to read any of this? And so, around finals week or whatever, when I'll get 75 emails over the course of like 6 minutes, like I can't do this. Being on a phone call with Van Ness, like, he won't silence his computer. And earlier when I talked about fencing, like the beep, but if you do it, if there's 100 people fencing, it just sounds unbroken beep. Our inboxes make this little noise, and Van Ness just goes and it sounds like this child's toy that just doesn't stop. He's like, he must get like 1,000 emails an hour. But it's at Christmas, you're getting to the holiday season, you're working for UPS. It's like, how am I supposed to? I can't do it. And so my brother is at the end of this conveyor belt, and he just starts scooping his arm and getting like 5 or 6 boxes at once, and just like scoop chucking them toward the truck. He's like, I can't do. I mean, there's like, I don't know, 40 boxes a minute more than I'm capable of loading. And so one time he scooped like 4 or 5 boxes, just like chucked him at the van and at the truck, and one of them hit the rim of the truck and broke open, and chocolate went everywhere. And my brother just sat down. It's like, oh, fuck this. And he just started eating the chocolates. It's like, they'll get their money back. I'm just going to say, I can't do that. All the boxes just falling off the conveyor belt. My brother's just sitting there eating chocolates that opened up. That's what metabolism is. That's how everything works, right? That's why you can never get a hold of Van Ness and me. And that's how metabolism works. Metabolism works fine when it's operating under normal conditions, when there's a normal amount of the electron transport chain happening, right? We're feeding the right amount of electrons and protons across but as soon as you start exercising, it becomes UPS on December 20th, and it's just broken. You just can't do it. It just doesn't work. And so you create a ton of these free radicals during intense exercise. You create way more free radicals. It just doesn't work. You create way more free radicals than you do during, if you're just out there for a walk. And here's, my brother breaking open a box and eating some chocolates. Now, if nitric oxide is present, and you create all this all of this superoxide, you can create peroxide nitrite. That's bad, right? So when everyone's taking their, like, oh, I have my nitric oxide supplement, like, I don't know what it is. What are you thinking? This is just dumb. Is it going to harm you? Oh, I doubt it, but it's certainly not going to help you, right? It's not going to help you, and if anything, it's going to harm you. But even then, I doubt it's going to do that. So there's a couple of fates of creating all of these things, and it doesn't really matter. Hydrogen peroxide, hopefully you convert it into that and break it down into harmless stuff. But the idea is, during intense exercise, it's UPS on December 20th. You create a bunch of free radicals, a bunch of reactive oxygen species, right? Oxygen with an unpaired electron, whatever free radicals you're generating. And these things have an effect on performance. What effect do they have on performance? I don't know. It's hard to tell. Like, what effect do hydrogen ions have on performance? I don't know. It's hard to tell. But how do we know that hydrogen ions have an effect on performance? How do we know that pH ruins our ability to continue exercising? Well, take a bunch of baking soda and you perform better if you're not vomiting and pooping and stuff. Take a bunch of baking soda. Well, how do we know that reactive oxygen species have an effect on performance? Same thing. Get these scavenging compounds. So this is from, I pulled it up this morning. Bestworkoutsupplementsblog.com, and this purple one, it says it contains micronized bicarbonate to directly combat lactic acid. Like, this is 2020. This is December 2020, and it says that. That's obviously not what it's doing. But if you get these reactive oxygen species scavenging compounds, which is not like vitamin C. Vitamin C doesn't work. Vitamin E doesn't work. You're not going to go get a pill and do it. But like prescription drugs and stuff, you can do it. It actually works. It actually works. Acetylcysteine, this is like if you have a Tylenol overdose, this is what you're going to take. But from a supplement store, you're not going to get any of these things that work. From a pharmacist, you can get something that works, and it can ward off fatigue. So we know that reactive oxygen species induce fatigue. How does it induce fatigue? I don't know. Right? There's a lot of stuff that can be affected. And so, like calcium, I mean, just if you go through that list of here's the big picture items. Sure, some of that stuff, maybe calcium sensitivity of the contractile apparatus, or it's the sarcoplasmic reticulum function, that ATPase, maybe there's some impairment. So you are impairing the uptake of calcium, the reuptake of calcium. Remember, regulation is so important. Depolarization induced calcium release. So not the calcium induced calcium release that everything else is affecting, but maybe the depolarization induced calcium release. The sodium potassium pump activity, maybe that is a little bit compromised. There's a bunch of stuff that it seems to do that impairs performance, but nobody really has a clear narrative of how this works. All we really know is that you take a scavenging compound and you perform better. So clearly there's something going on. And just like with pH, you're going as you exercise, you will net your own endogenous buffering improves, whether it's free radicals or whether it is pH. The endogenous dealing with those molecules is better. You improve, you get better. Why would you improve it if it wasn't helpful? Specificity of adaptation. This is clearly something threatening your performance. Why don't we buffer some of this endogenously, inside of our insides? One more thing as a lead in to inflammation is the reactive oxygen species. That's what ROS is. Lipid peroxidation, mostly arachidonic acid. Remember, we have unpaired electrons in these reactive oxygen species. So for stealing electrons from lipids, and again, mostly arachidonic acid, we get these isoprostanes, so prostaglandin-like compounds, and the perception of pain increases, and maybe some really long-term fatigue. You're crossing the marathon line, and pain and fatigue may be coming from some of these things. So the reactive oxygen species, how do they work? I don't know. How do they cause fatigue? I don't know. But they do cause fatigue, and there's a bunch of proposed mechanisms that may or may not be, legit. So here's a summary of everything. Doesn't really matter. Yeah, again, just the proposed mechanisms, a grain of something, like a grain of fishbowl rock, like that big, of like those teal and blue rocks at the bottom of like a fish tank. Take a grain that big of salt. Reactive oxygen species. This is really the best explanation. UPS on December 20th. That's the best explanation. You have an unpaired electron, the superoxide, you're going to generate a ton of it during vigorous exercise because you just can't handle the workload. And inflammation. So let's move on to inflammation as a source of fatigue. Now, inflammation, chronic delayed onset muscle soreness. We know what this prostaglandins and some bradykinins, and so inflammation is the leader of delayed onset muscle soreness, but it's also going to induce fatigue a little bit. Interleukin 6 is one I talked about but didn't put in any slides because it's pro hypertrophy and anti hypertrophy. I mean, it's a weird one. But your skeletal muscle is going to release a lot of stuff. We talked about IL-15, interleukin 15. That's anabolic, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Wonderful, released during exercise. I talk about that at the grad level, where it's just if you want brain health, BDNF is about as good as it gets. But there's a lot of things get released during exercise. We see performance suffering in their presence. Now, you can just administer IL-6. You can just give runners IL-6 and watch their performance get bad, right? So we see fatigue just like with hydrogen ions, just like with reactive oxygen species, inflammatory mediators. It's probably a lot of central fatigue, right? IL-6, this one crosses the blood-brain barrier. It's hard to know exactly how effects are manifesting. Now, one of the interesting things is like ibuprofen doesn't enhance performance. Even in the presence of injury or pain, you don't really see ibuprofen enhancing performance. And I'll talk about that on Friday with the central fatigue thing. With Tylenol seems to work a little bit, but it's not really anti-inflammatory. I'm seeing analgesic, but the anti-inflammatories don't seem to enhance performance all that much. So the inflammation one is a little bit weird. Okay, structural damage to tissues. This is a drawing of a horse, right? It's a bad drawing of a horse. That's not what the teeth look like. There's a gap here. What its guts are falling out. I don't know what's going on with his legs. It doesn't have any joints. That tail looks dangerous. The saddle is a this is a bad drawing of a horse. Okay, this is that equivalent of the horse with a sarcomere, right? So you're up here and it looks okay. I mean, it doesn't look good, but it looks okay. So this is your myosin. You got some actin over here. This is a Z disc. Um, and your M line is out here in the middle. You remember the Titan that goes from the Z disc to the M line, alpha actin over here. And but the myosin can actually reach the actin in a healthy, normal sarcomere. Now you bang it up a little bit, and it's like, like, what am I supposed to grab onto? You really bang that thing up, and like, what is it grabbing, right? So structural damage, we're seeing some problems. Now, structural damage is also going to elicit an inflammatory response. There's going to be pain associated with it. Pain is going to remember the Odson DeLuca stuff from the second section. Pain is going to limit neural drive, the ability to recruit those fibers. So get kicked in the shin and try to just bear weight on that leg. So there's a lot going on here, but one of them is just like this stuff has to be really, the architecture has to be perfect for this stuff to work. Okay, so that's structural damage. Heat. Heat is a major cause of fatigue, but it's going to come back when we're doing the central, because there's some fascinating experiments with heat. How does it cause fatigue? Well, enzymes function in specific heat ranges. I mean, just cook an egg. What happens to the egg? Or perm your hair or whatever. You denature these proteins, but even before the denaturing, where the egg white becomes white, right? Where it's this transparency thing, and then it becomes white. Even before that amount of heat, you're losing function. You're losing function, or you get really cold and you lose function. So enzymes, there's a specific heat range. You get really hot, you start overheating, and your metabolism is just a bunch of enzymes. Good luck having a metabolism. That's the main, that is among the scariest parts of heat induced fatigue, because heat strokes, if you're looking at heat exhaustion and heat strokes, any type of heat illness, metabolism is just enzymes. It's a summation of enzymatic responses of all of these chemical, responses happening in your body. If the enzymes don't behave, you don't have a metabolism, you're dead. So that's really where things go awry. The blood distribution changes also in the presence of heat. You get hot and you're going to try to dissipate heat. You're going to get more blood going to the skin to try to offload some of that heat, especially if the outside temperature isn't, if the outside temperature is like 70 and your inside temperature is, 102. You're going to be trying to dissipate heat that way. And you're going to sweat a bunch. Oxygen dissociation curve shifting right means your muscle, what's metabolically active? Because metabolism releases heat. You get heat from metabolism. A dead body is room temperature. A living body is 98, 99 degrees, whatever. When people say 98.6, that's like nonsense. That's off of Civil War analyses. I mean, some people are 98.6, but the idea of that number 98.6, that's nobody listening to this is like, I'm 98.6. There are daily fluctuations. Seem to be annual fluctuations. And there's a lot of stuff that's going to influence this, whether it's drugs or sex or whatever. Not as a verb, sex is a noun. What you are, what your chromosomal constitution is, although both, I guess, would influence it. But metabolism releases heat. Metabolism releases heat. You have to deliver oxygen to metabolically active tissues. They're the ones consuming oxygen. So your hemoglobin releases oxygen when it's hot, right? Because where is it hot? Well, metabolically active tissues are super hot. Go exercise. That muscle gets really hot. Maybe your toes are cold and your bicep curls are making your biceps hot. Where metabolically active tissue is hot. And so you're going to drop off your oxygen from the hemoglobin wherever it's hot. And if everything's hot, your hemoglobin gets bad. More reactive oxygen species at higher temperatures. Electrolyte balances get a little bit funky. Stroke volume and heart rate, what's called cardiac drift. As you exercise, now there's a little bit more to it than this, but this is the vast majority of the phenomenon. As you exercise, you sweat. Where does that hydration come from? Well, blood volume. That's a huge bunch of fluid in your body. And I mean, there's other areas too, but you're going to lose a lot of blood volume. Now, if you lose blood volume, you're not going to have the same ejection with each beat. So you have to beat that heart faster, faster and faster and faster. That heart has to beat. So your stroke volume goes down, your heart rate goes up. That's what cardiac drift is over time. In heat, you're going to really see that, and your heart has to work harder. Increased rating of perceived exertion and decreased central drive. So there's a lot of mechanisms where heat is going to influence performance. And we'll talk about the central drive piece, this whole number 7 section on Friday. Carbohydrate availability. When carbs get low, watch somebody at the end of a marathon. When carbs get low, performance suffers. People get loopy and performance suffers. And if people just have a glucose drink, right, blood sugar, just have one of these drinks, and compared to a placebo, we're seeing about a 9%. This is just one study, but ballpark figure 9% increase in power output. And a lot of this stuff is going to be cycling performance, is often what people are doing for these studies. For the power output, if you combine fructose with it, give subjects fructose too, you're going to see an increased power output, average power output throughout. So clearly, the availability of carbs matters. Now, the reason, why not just give them more glucose? You have maximum absorption rates of glucose and a maximum absorption rate of fructose. So glucose, you're going to have a different mechanism. This sodium-dependent glucose transporter, you're going to have a slightly different mechanism of getting it into the cells. Fructose, different, right? You have GLUT5 and GLUT2 for fructose. And so you have these different roads. So you're going to get traffic, right? You're going to get this big traffic jam if you just put in like 100 grams of glucose. But if you go 50 glucose, 50 fructose, right? And usually what people do is a 2-to-1, where it'll be like, 40 glucose and 20 fructose, something like that. Then those roads, you're not going to have the same traffic jam because you have double the roads loading up the tissues for these things. And this is just looking at, like, if you combine, you're going to get better oxidation rates. Or if you just do glucose, just do fructose, glucose is a little bit better than fructose. Fructose isn't that good of a sugar. If you combine them, you're going to get a better oxidation rate. And fructose, there's the fates of these things. It doesn't really leave the liver. Fructose is a most of it is going to be retained by the liver. And the fates of fructose, it sort of enters, glycolysis. A lot of it is going to enter glycolysis at glyceraldehyde 3 phosphate dehydrogenase. It enters as G3P, so it's after the regulatory enzyme of PFK, and you're going to find a lot of it being contributing to fatty acid synthesis. And so this idea of oh, just eat, like, I've heard people say, like, oh, monkeys eat bananas and they never get fat, just eat a bunch of what are you talking about? Like, fructose is like the worst sugar you can have. I mean, it depends. Fructose, it sort of depends. Yeah, that's not like the only sugar in fruit. So I'm not saying all fruit is bad or anything like that. But some of fructose enters glycolysis as fructose 6 phosphate. So right before PFK, and a lot of it is going to enter after PFK, right? The regulatory enzyme of this, and then we're going to end up seeing fatty acid synthesis. So the fructose to glucose conversion, depending on the situation, right? Depending on the exercise situation and the dose and all this stuff, convert some of it. This is just a look at where glucose is everyone knows how that works. Glucose is not like a confusing sugar. Fructose is weird. These are just the enzymes. You see 4, 7, 8, and 9. Those are the enzymes right there. So this is it's fructose. I wouldn't do that in bulk. Tryptophan, serotonin, you remember how this one works. Tryptophan has to actually get into the brain to become serotonin in a way that has an effect, in a way that has a fatiguing effect, a central drive effect. And if you have a bunch of insulin, insulin is not clearing tryptophan from the bloodstream. What it's clearing is its competition on the large neutral amino acid transporters. Insulin is really clearing out those branched chain amino acids. Tryptophan also is going to be weakly bound to albumin. And if you release a bunch of fat during exercise, prolonged exercise, you release a bunch of fat. Fat is going to be more strongly bound to albumin. It's going to kick tryptophan off. Free tryptophan is what's going to bind. It's what's going to load up onto those large neutral amino acid transporters to get into the brain. That's it. We'll do central fatigue on Friday. And for a really long lecture where you're not tested on any of this, and it's a super long lecture, I'm surprised how many people are here now that I can see something other than the slide. All right, what questions do we have?
I kind of have a question about, like, I guess endurance exercise or like a prolonged exercise. So what's going on when, like, you first start the exercise and you really feel the burn, and then after, say it's like a mile run, like the first, I don't know, quarter mile is pretty tough, and then it sort of numbs out, and then you start to feel it again. Like, what's going on there?
Yeah, really good question. So fat metabolism is so sluggish and it's just slow and it takes forever to get going. I mean, really takes a long time, fat metabolism. And carbs aren't even all that fast. But fat metabolism is really slow. And if you can be very oxidative in your metabolism, you're fine, right? It's going to be a little more comfortable. You find your pace, that sort of steady state cardio. You're not going to get this, big burning sensation. But right at first, um, not the burning sensation, but the fatigue part of it. At first, it is very glycolytic when you start, and there are mechanisms of fatigue. I guess probably a lot of centrally mediated phenomena of but the actual sensations, you're just not using oxidative metabolism very effectively at first. It's object at rest. It just doesn't want to get going. And once you get that going and you become much more oxidative, it becomes more comfortable of the run. But yeah, so you're pretty glycolytic at the beginning.
Okay, got it.
One more then. Would supplementation of arachidonic acid act as an antioxidant because the reactive oxygen species would steal the acid from the free arachidonic acid?
I'm so tired. Will you say that one more time? I think the question was totally fine. It's me. I had a lecture right before this one, and then I slept horribly last night. So one more time.
Okay. Does supplementation of arachidonic acid act as an antioxidant because the reactive oxygen species would steal from the free arachidonic acid?
I like that idea. That's clever. Yeah, I mean, you convert to isoprostanes. I mean, if you were to do that, but could you stop any damage happening to, let's say it's like a sarcolemma or something like that, some bilayer somewhere? Uh, I like the idea. I don't see why not. But you would still have, you would sort of get these like prostaglandin like compounds. It's clever. It's clever. That's a good question. All of my answers were terrible, but you had good questions. Those are good ones. Anyone else? All right, we have one more to go. And on Friday, I'll just do another long one. And I mean, feel free to stay, feel free, whatever you want on Friday. But I'll go through the case studies too at the end. I'll do central fatigue, and then we'll go through case studies. So I'll see everyone in a couple days.
Thank you.
Thank you.